Welcome back to Vintage Camera Digest. Today's episode is part 2 in a series about processing black and white film at home. In the first episode, we went over all the stuff you'll need to do this, but today we're actually going to develop this, a 120 roll of Ilford HP5. So, stick around. In the last episode, we talked about all of this stuff you'll need to be able to develop black and white film at home. I've got my changing bag, tank, and reels, containers, chemicals, thermometer, and a method for timing the process, which is going to be the Film Develop Pro app. What we didn't cover last time was the specific chemistry you'll need to be able to do the job. So let's go over that first. And in case you're wondering where I'm pulling all this information, it's from the Kodak Black and White Darkroom Data Guide. I have a late 80s version and an early 80s version, and they are in agreement, so that's good. The textbook standard developing process for black and white negative film recommends the use of 5 chemicals: developer, stop bath, fixer, hypoclearing agent, and a wetting agent. And when it comes to the developer, this is where you have a lot of choices. And each different developer is going to have different recommended developing times and will produce certain characteristics. Some developers will give you very sharp negatives at the expense of emphasizing film grain. Some will minimize the appearance of grain and produce a smoother look. Some developers have a really long shelf life. There are multiple reasons why one might choose one particular developer over another, but I'm not going to go over all of that here. I'm just saying that when it comes to the developers, you have a lot of choices. Now the rest of the process, stop bath, fixer, hypoclear, wetting agent, are pretty standardized. The wild card in the process is always going to be the developer. Now what the developer is going to do to your film is build up density in all the areas that were struck with a suitable amount of light. Some developers can be used more than once, others are going to be one shot only. The next step will be the stop bath. The stop bath's job is to immediately halt the development process. Timing for the stop bath is usually about 30 seconds with gentle agitation. And stop bath is reusable until its action is exhausted. If you use an indicator stop bath, you'll know it's time for a new batch when it changes color. Following that is the fixer. The fixer's job is to remove all the silver salts that weren't developed in the development stage and fix or make permanent the areas that were developed. For this step, we'll need to agitate for the first 30 seconds, then once each following minute. Fixer is also reusable to a point. Eventually it will become exhausted and you'll need to fix up a new batch. Total time for this step is variable, and we'll come back to this point in just a little bit. After the fixer is a 30-second rinse in running water, and we can do this with the lid off of the tank, because once the film has been fixed, the development part of this process is complete. After the fixer is what we call the hypoclear. The hypoclear is going to remove all the last remnants of the fixer from the film, which is going to help your negatives to last a long, long time, like 100 years or something like that. See, that's why film is cool, because unless you set fire to the negatives, they're gonna last. But if too much fixer remains on the film after processing, it can lead to a shorter lifespan of your negatives, like 50 years instead of 100. Hypoclear is typically one shot, so you use up what you need for the session and then you discard it afterwards. Timing with hypoclear is 2 minutes with agitation for the first 30 seconds and then occasionally after that. After the hypoclear is going to be the film wash, and you'll set your film under running water for 5 minutes or so. All of the hypoclear and remaining fixer will be flushed out. After the wash is the wetting agent, and I'm going to be using Kodak PhotoFlow for this. You only mix a very small amount of PhotoFlow to a liter of water, and you can reuse it for several processes. We'll dip the film in for 30 seconds, then remove it from the reel and hang it up to dry. The wetting agent's main job is to keep water spots from forming on the film as it dries. Now, there are some resources that recommend removing the excess water from your film by using a film squeegee, and this will speed up the drying process. And in my entire life, I've done this probably only once or twice. And why is that? Well, it's because using a squeegee on your film is the absolute best way to add a scratch across the entire roll. When the emulsion is wet, it's particularly vulnerable to damage, so it's beyond me how this ever became a thing. So take my advice and don't squeegee your film. Now, all of that was the textbook method, and that is what I will officially recommend. But the only two chemicals that are absolutely necessary for film processing are the developer and the fixer. You can successfully develop film without any of these others. Instead of a stop bath, you can just use water to rinse off the developer. Fill the tank up a couple of times and pour it out. It won't immediately stop the development process, but it will do a pretty good job of it, and it does work. The thing about stop bath is that it's quite acidic, and it has a very sharp smell. I've dealt with migraine headaches all my life, and the smell of stop bath is definitely a trigger for me. So in all my years of processing, I've mostly just used a water bath in the stop bath step. Now, since the smell of stop bath is a known issue and a problem, we're now able to find what they call odorless stop bath. And that's what I'll be using for this process. Spoiler alert though, it still smells. It's just not as strong, and they've attempted to mask it with vanilla. After the fixer step, we have the HypoClear. But again, you can skip this step and go straight to the film wash. Just be sure to wash your film 2 to 3 times as long as you would if you were using the HypoClear. So up to a 15-minute wash instead of 5. Now, most of this chemistry plays double duty in the darkroom. You use some of the same ones for print processing. You still use stop bath, you use fixer, and you can use HypoClear. And I'd say that the HypoClear is more important on the printing side of things, especially if you're printing with fiber-based papers, because these can absorb and hold on to the fixer. And the HypoClear then becomes a necessary step. Film doesn't really have much ability to absorb any of the chemistry though, so while it's not a bad idea to use HypoClear in this process, it's not as necessary as it would be in making prints on fiber-based papers. Now after the wash, you have the wetting agent. And you can skip this if you want to, but be warned that you'll probably end up with water spots on your film. It's not a 100% necessary step, but it is one that I always do, and I do recommend it. Now, I've read hundreds of times of people using a drop of dishwashing liquid instead of a real wetting agent. I've never done this. Dishwashing liquid is most likely going to have other things like moisturizers and such in it, so I'm not going to recommend doing that. Plus, PhotoFlow really isn't that expensive, and since you use only a very small amount at a time, a bottle is going to last you a long time. Anyway, the process I'll be demonstrating is going to be the official version, not the rogue version. Besides, if those other chemicals were completely unnecessary, they wouldn't even be manufactured. But since they are, that's what I'm going to use. So, let's do this. The first thing I'm going to do is load the film onto the reel in the changing bag. And for this demonstration, I'm going to use this tank that I got off of Amazon for $35. The creatively named Compact Developing Tank. Because after giving it a good once over in the last episode, I think it's going to be pretty easy to work with. I'm sort of excited about this, so we'll see. I'm also going to cut a small piece of the film off of one end in the bag, because we're going to need that in a little bit to test the fixer. So let's load the film and get going. There we go, loaded up. So next, before I measure out all the chemistry I need, I'm going to equip myself with PPE, personal protective equipment. Now, you may be thinking this is overkill, and I can certainly understand that, but the truth is these chemicals are kind of nasty. If you read the safety data sheets on this stuff, you might be surprised. Here's what it says for D76, which is the developer I'm using. Harmful if swallowed, may cause an allergic skin reaction, causes serious eye damage, suspected of causing genetic defects, may damage fertility or the unborn child, may cause damage to organs through prolonged or repeated exposure. This material is considered hazardous by OSHA. So we're going to do this the right way. Now earlier I said that this process is kind of like a recipe, and you know how much easier recipes go when you have all your ingredients prepped and measured out before you start. Well, this works in the same way. So let's get the developer ready. I have one roll of 120 to process, and that's going to require 590 milliliters. So let's round that off to 600 to make it easy. The developer I'm using, like I said earlier, is Kodak D76. And with D76, you can use it in a few different dilutions. You can use it full strength, or you can dilute it 1-to-1 with water, or you can dilute it 1-to-3 with water. However, the more dilute the developer is, the longer the time is going to be required for development. So I'm going to compromise and use it in the 1-to-1 mix. And there are two reasons I want to do this. First, and the main reason, is economy. I'll only be needing half as much of the developer as I would if I were using it full strength. Second, I prefer a bit of a longer development time because it improves the consistency and margin of error, so to speak. So let's get this measured out and ready. You'll notice that I'm going to use a jug of water instead of the tap. And there's two reasons for this. One, you probably want to use distilled water when mixing up your chemistry. And two, I keep the jug of water in the same location as my other chemistry. And that means it'll always be the same temperature as the developer when I mix the working solution. And one huge benefit of processing black and white film over color film is that the black and white process is done at room temperature, as long as your room temperature is between 18 and 24 degrees Celsius or 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So when I mix up the dilutions, I don't want the water to have a significantly different temperature than the rest of it, because then that just throws everything out of kilter. So let's start measuring this out. I need 600 milliliters of D76. So I'm going to pour out 300 milliliters. Next, I'm going to add 300 milliliters of the water. We'll put that in there and start testing that. I need a smaller beaker that I'm going to put our little test batch of fixer in. Don't need much, just a little bit. Now earlier I mentioned that fixer is reusable to a certain point. Eventually though, it will become exhausted and lose its ability to fix. So stop bath usually changes color when it's exhausted, but fixer doesn't. So you can't really tell by looking at it if it's done. When I loaded the film onto the reel, I just cut a very small portion off the end of it, and I'm going to use this to test the strength of the fixer to determine how long that part of the process should be. Poured a little bit of fixer in here, and then I'm going to drop this strip in. Then I'm going to start my stopwatch. What's happening here is that this piece of film has been exposed to light, but it hasn't been developed. We're putting it straight into the fixer, bypassing the development process. And what does fixer do? Well, it dissolves all of the silver salts that haven't been developed. So since this piece hasn't been developed, the fixer is going to remove all of it, and we'll be left with a clear piece of film. So I'm timing how long it takes for the film to clear. Then I'm going to double that time to determine how long the fixer part of the process should be. So it is well cleared within a minute of being in the fixer. So normally I would double that for the fixing time, but I like to keep fixing times between 3 to 7 minutes, and that's also going to depend on what film you're developing. Ilford HP5, like I have here, usually fixes pretty quick, as it has this time. Kodak T-Max, on the other hand, takes a lot longer, and then other films are going to be somewhere in between. All right, everything is measured out and ready, and the tank is loaded. So the very next thing I want to do is measure the temperature of the developer. I've got the thermometer in there already, and it is reading at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's check out what my development time is for that. So 66 degrees Fahrenheit is about 19 degrees Celsius. I'm entering this information in my Film Develop Pro app. So the size is 120. Film is the Ilford HP5 Plus. Push and pull, I've not done any of that. I've rated it at box speed, so it's at ISO 400. The developer I'm using is Kodak D76 at a dilution of 1:1. Temperature is 19 degrees Celsius. So that gives me a complete development time of 11 minutes and 30 seconds. One thing you have to do with this is you have to agitate the film correctly. Proper agitation is key, because insufficient agitation will cause problems with the film. Extreme agitation will cause other problems with the film. So we'll agitate correctly and gently. And it gives me a timer here that beeps every time you need to make another agitation. One thing I will say to begin with is once we pour the developer in, I'm going to tap the bottom of the tank a couple of times to kind of dislodge any air bubbles that might have come into that. And I will start off the process by agitating for 30 seconds. And then we'll move to once a minute. This is a very easy pour in. Right, I'm going to agitate by inversion. So I'm going to do this 30 seconds. All right. So every time I need to do another agitation, it'll beep. And when I do agitation, I'm just going to invert it 3 or 4 times. There we go. So we're coming up on the final 10 seconds of the process. We started the pour in at about 10 seconds prior to the process, so we'll go ahead and pour out. Now pour in the stop bath. So I still have the timer running, and we need to do this for 30 seconds. I'm going to reuse the stop bath. So I'm going to pour it back into the container. Now we're going to pour in the fixer. Agitate for 30 seconds. And then once a minute afterwards. So I am going to pour the fixer back out, and I'm going to save that because it's still plenty useful. Okay. Also, this tank, it did not leak doing the inversions to begin with, but as I got further along in the process, it did start to leak. So there's a little puddle of stuff here underneath that I don't like. So for the rest of the process in the agitation, I'm going to use this agitator stick that they send along with it, which just moves the film back and forth. So I've got a 30-second rinse before we put the HypoClear in. I'm going to fill up the tank a couple of times and dump it out. So since we're done with the fixing phase, I'm going to open it up. And looks like I have images on the film. I always hold my breath till I see that. Alright, let's put that there. HypoClear, 2 minutes. I'll agitate with this now. The swizzle stick method of agitation. There's a lot of debate online about whether that's a good way to do that or not. If you go too fast with it, you can cause some surge marks in the film where the chemistry's moving too fast, right? The key to development and the key to agitation is always do it gently and not too much. Maybe I'm easily amused, but taking the lid off of the tank and seeing that developed film for the first time always gives me a little bit of excitement. There's some suspense in between the shooting and the developing process. And maybe that's why I enjoy the analog process as much as I do. Because once the image is made, you still have to work for the development part of it. It's not complete until that's done. Alright, it's been 2 minutes. HypoClear is one shot, so I'm discarding it after each use. Now all that remains to do is wash this with running water for 5 minutes. So let's get that going. While that rinses, I'm going to remove the gloves because I don't want to contaminate the film anymore after this. I'm going to clean up a little bit here. Alright, 5 minutes is up. So here we have a nice roll of processed HP5. So the next step is going to be to use PhotoFlow as the wetting agent. And what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to do this here, I'm going to go do this in my shower where I always let this dry, is we'll dunk this in there for 30 seconds, agitate it maybe just slightly, and then we'll hang it up and it will dry. When we hang it up, how do you hang it up? What do you use to hang it up with? I have 2 suction cups and some picture hanging wire and a few little clips that stretch across. Seems to work really well for that. So, I'm gonna go do that. We'll be back in a minute. Well, that was easy, right? And you can absolutely do this with just a little bit of initial outlay for the tank, beakers, and thermometers. And this stuff will last forever. I mean, it's sort of like a lifetime purchase. All of this stuff that I have, except for that new tank and reel set and one of their thermometers, I've had for nearly 40 years. And a few of these beakers, like this one, was probably 40 years old when I got it. One important thing that we do need to talk about is how do we dispose of the chemistry? Well, you'll need to check with your local ordinances to be sure, but one thing that is absolutely certain is that if your house implements a septic tank system for waste, you do not want to pour any of this down the drain. This stuff is toxic, so it will certainly affect any bacteria that we rely on in a septic tank system. So what I do is dump all the one-shot chemicals I use in the process into this large container. And I have several of these, and about twice a year I take these all to a film lab that isn't too terribly far away, and they'll dispose of it for me. They have a silver recovery system. Remember that film emulsions are based on silver salts, and this gives them a little extra silver, so they don't mind doing it. Another thing that you can do is pour it into a shallow container and set it outside in a place where no pets or wildlife can get to it, and simply let it evaporate. But again, you'll need to check with your local laws to be sure you're in compliance. Next up on the channel, I'll be explaining or attempting to explain push processing and pull processing, when and why you might want to do that, and how it works. And that'll wrap up this series on black and white film development for now. So you don't want to miss it, and I'll see you next time. So it occurred to me that you might want to see the results of the film that we just processed. So we do have negatives. Not a very interesting subject, but this role is going to be part of the test we do with push processing and pull processing in a video that will be coming up very soon. So see you at that point.